Hey everyone, we're here. Thanks for tuning in. I am, as promised, here live with Toby Young of the Free Speech Union and the Daily Skeptic. Thank you for joining me, Toby.
Thanks, Meghan.
So we actually have good news today, which I honestly didn't expect. I mean, sort of good news for you in any case. PayPal banned your Free Speech Union and Daily Skeptic Union accounts on September 15th. And then I believe a couple days ago reinstated them. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So PayPal banned my personal account and the accounts of the Daily Skeptic and the Free Speech Union, which caused an extraordinary headache for me because about a third of the Free Speech Union's 9,500 members are paying their recurring membership dues using PayPal. And about a quarter of the donors to the Daily Skeptic are also making their donations via PayPal. So it was, an existential threat to the survival of those enterprises. So it was really serious.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I run a website too, and currently all donations are coming in through PayPal, and a lot of people have been canceling lately, which I totally support. But sucks for our longevity. Although we're working on getting a Stripe donation button set up so that people can move over. But a lot of people, and particularly people who are running like websites, podcasts, media stuff. I mean, anything where you receive donations, I feel like is probably going to be connected to PayPal, which puts us in a really precarious situation.
Yeah, I mean they're essentially a monopoly provider in the UK. I don't know about the US, but in the UK they are 8 times larger than their nearest competitor. And as you say, lots of businesses, lots of websites, alternative media of various kinds depend on PayPal for their survival. So if PayPal decides it's going to start shutting down accounts because people or organizations are expressing views that for one reason or another they disapprove of, then that's really serious and poses a real threat to freedom of speech.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. I just for those watching right now, I actually want to remind people that if you do want to ask questions for Toby, please do so. It's hard for me to keep track of everything that's going on in the live chat. So if you use the super chat, I'm more likely to be able to see those questions. But yeah, if you have questions that you want to pose to him, please put them in the live chat. I'm not looking at the comments below. So what does the Free Speech Union do?
So the Free Speech Union is an organization I set up in February of 2020 to defend free speech. And it does that. It's a membership organization. So if you join the Free Speech Union, and it's not expensive, it's like membership starts at about £2.49 a month, which at the moment is roughly $2.49, given the weakness of the pound. If you get into trouble, if an outrage mob comes for you, we will defend you. And in some cases, we'll engage lawyers to do that. We've got 2 full-time lawyers on the company payroll. We've got a legal advisory council consisting of 50 plus lawyers. And we frequently do go to bat for people in court who find themselves in trouble simply for exercising their lawful right to free speech. We also put on events. So we had a book party on Tuesday for Andrew Doyle, the creator of the sublime Titania McGrath character on Twitter, amongst other achievements. And he's written a great new book called The New Puritans, comparing woke ideologues to witch finders in 17th century Salem. And we had a book party for him. I interviewed him on stage, and we have those sorts of events all the time. And we also publish frequently asked questions for our members who kind of want to know, for instance, what to do if they're asked to declare their gender pronouns in the workplace on their email signatures and so forth. What to do about that if they're asked to do that and they don't want to do it? What are their rights? What can they legitimately decline to do without risking their jobs? It provides those sort of 3 functions: research and lobbying, events and entertainment, and most importantly, protecting people when cancellation mobs come for them.
Can I ask you, since you mentioned this, and I get this question quite often, and I don't know that I have a great answer, but what do you tell people to do if they're asked to include their gender pronouns in, like, I don't know, their work email signature? Or I know that it often happens to people I know in meetings. You have a Zoom meeting and everyone's asked to announce their pronouns before the meeting starts, and on and on and on. What should people do if they don't want to participate in that?
Well, I think they should just politely decline. Try and do so in a civil way. And if you're asked why, you could either appeal to privacy, or you could boldly state that the fact that you are being asked to declare your pronouns is implicitly an endorsement of gender critical ideology, and it's an ideology you don't share. So people may think of it as a kind of fairly innocuous, kind of politically neutral thing to do. Why would anyone make a fuss? But actually, it's not politically neutral. It's not innocuous. It effectively, tacitly endorses gender ideology. And if you have problems with that particular ideology, then you won't want to do that. And that's the main reason members of ours don't want to do it. Most of them are gender critical feminists and don't see why they should effectively be forced to endorse a point of view that, in their opinion, denies sex-based women's rights. So yeah, you could go into depth and detail about it if you want to, but my advice would just be to politely decline and just appeal to privacy, unless you want to get into an argument.
Yeah, and I mean, I've thought about it. I don't know if this would stand up in a court or as like a legal argument, but I've thought about it in terms of a religious freedom issue, because gender identity ideology is a religion. It's faith-based as far as I'm concerned. And I would say, or one of the things I might say if I were in that situation would be like, this isn't my religion. It's akin to me as being forced to say, I believe in God, or announcing a religious affiliation at the beginning of a meeting, or putting that in my email signature.
Yeah. And it's compelled speech. And to compel someone to effectively endorse an ideology that they don't share is a breach of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, I think if people are punished by their employers, in the UK anyway, for refusing to state their preferred gender pronouns in the workplace, then they would have, a decent shot at suing their employer in the European Court of Human Rights.
And what does the Daily Skeptic do?
The Daily Skeptic is a website. It's like a news publishing website I started in April 2020, just when Britain went into lockdown for the first time. And it was originally called Lockdown Skeptics, and it became a kind of meeting place for people who were skeptical about lockdowns and associated COVID restrictions like mask wearing. I contribute to it. We have a lot of authors, intellectuals, scientists, professors writing for it, and it's become a kind of focal point, or became a focal point during the lockdowns, for kind of informed, intelligent, evidence-based criticisms of the lockdown policy and associated restrictions. But when all the restrictions were lifted in the UK on July 19th of last year, we broadened it out, and it became the Daily Skeptic. And now we're more broadly skeptical about all kinds of policies supposedly informed by, quote unquote, the science, but which actually have not a great deal of scientific validity.
Right. And I mean, I remember when I interviewed you for the first time, which was in April 2020, I believe, you described yourself as a COVID skeptic. And you were like one of the first ones, as far as I'm concerned, who I think you were speaking out about what was going on with regard to COVID and the lockdowns and what you feared was to come. And I actually learned a lot from talking to you and people like Peter Hitchens and some other people, because at first, like the first when it was just, like 2 weeks, I was on board and I was like, everybody stop whining. And then I was like, oh no, they're right. This is bad. And I had to take that all back. But what was it that kind of tipped you off early on?
I think it was just an instinctive dislike of all our freedoms being taken away in one fell swoop by an overbearing state. I just felt instinctively that that was dangerous and wrong. And I didn't think it would just be 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And I feared that if we just stood calmly by when the state interfered with our liberty in this way, then that would effectively provide the state with a license to do so again. So it proved to be. After the first lockdown, we had lockdown number 2 in the UK, and then we had lockdown number 3. And it's not inconceivable that if monkeypox becomes more prevalent than it is at present, there'll be another lockdown, or if there's another wave of COVID in the UK, there'll be another lockdown. So I think we have to be very vigilant about it. But I think it was the interference in our liberty on a scale hitherto never seen before, certainly on these islands, which set the alarm off for me.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even Biden has said, the pandemic's over. Most of the mandates have been lifted, even finally in Canada, which I didn't expect, but I think Trudeau got so much pressure and he's become so unpopular from what I can see because of what he did to the truckers, to the Freedom Convoy, to supporters of the truckers and the Freedom Convoy. What he said about people who were opposed to his authoritarian mandates, to the mask mandates. He called them racist, he called them misogynist, he froze the bank accounts of people who were either involved in the convoy or supporting the convoy, which is insane and not something I would have expected to ever see happen in Canada. But just recently he's been forced to lift his stupid vaccine mandates for flying, and the mask mandates. And I mean, but do you think this is over? Like, is this actually over, or are we going to see more COVID?
No, I
crap?
don't think. It's hard to tell. I'm not at all confident that there won't be attempts to lock us down again, but perhaps for different reasons. But certainly, if there's another viral outbreak, you can imagine the same policy being imposed on us again. It still happens in China whenever there's an outbreak of COVID. They don't seem to have rode back at all on their zero COVID strategy. I mean, one of the surprising things about Trudeau becoming so authoritarian about lockdowns in Canada and vaccine mandates, and crushing the Freedom Convoy in such an illiberal way, is that he styles himself a progressive. He's a man of the left, and the people who suffered the most from the lockdown policy were the most disadvantaged in our society: the elderly, children, the very poor. People like Trudeau didn't suffer in the slightest, and it just seems extraordinary. There was this kind of blindness to the suffering caused by those policies to the least well off. You would have thought that, someone who styles themselves a progressive and thinks of themselves as being on the left would have a bit more compassion for all the suffering to the least well off caused by the policies he was pursuing. But there was a kind of willful blindness to the effect of the lockdown policies and the associated restrictions by the advocates for the policy. I mean, it was more, the left on the whole was kind of much more enthusiastic about lockdowns than the right. I mean, it didn't always split along those lines, but broadly speaking, and it looks as though that's going to be one of the big issues in the US presidential election in 24. And I still haven't quite got my head around why it was that the left was such enthusiasts, by and large, for a policy that caused the least well-off to suffer the most.
I've never been able to figure that out either, except that what I think has happened in part is that the left have become the elite and have lost touch with working class people. But I mean, that's the same thing that happened in Canada. Progressives and the left across the board, really, I mean, it probably was even more divided in Canada than it was in the US. Canada is like a pretty progressive place, or seems to be that way anyway. They position themselves in that way. And most of the people that I know in Canada from my home in Vancouver are progressive people, vote left, maybe liberal, but never conservative, never right wing. And they all supported the mandates. They all participated in vilifying people who didn't want to get vaccinated, vilifying the truckers, vilifying people just who criticized the mandates. And even now, I just saw the other day this, the Socialist Party of Vancouver is running a candidate, and I'm sure all the other candidates probably agree with his perspective, who totally slandered and libeled and vilified the anti-maskers and the anti-vaxxers as fascists and as racist. Like, these are the socialists. Like, these are people who are supposed to be on the side of the working class, fighting for the marginalized, and they're vilifying the voiceless in Canada. And I don't mean literally voiceless, because they have, of course, spoken out, but they've been completely silenced by Canadian media, and have not been really represented at all in really any mainstream Canadian media, and then have been vilified by politicians and people who do have power and a voice. And I cannot figure out what the rationale for that is. These are the same people who support social media bans and, supported. I saw you wrote about, I can't remember his name, but somebody who wrote an article for the New Statesman, I believe, who essentially supported the idea that, PayPal is a private company, so they can deny services to whoever they like. And it's the same thing as a baker deciding he doesn't want to bake a cake for a gay marriage because it goes against his religion.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary article. Yeah, you wouldn't accept it, but sort of maybe not that surprising that the New Statesman, which is a left-wing magazine, the house magazine of the intellectual left in the UK, should be one of the only publications to actually defend PayPal's decision to censor me and the Free Speech Union. Quite extraordinary. And the idea that it's odd to see kind of people on the left appealing to a kind of libertarian argument for freedom of association to justify PayPal's actions, but when you think about it, it's just a form of discrimination. Just as, PayPal, I mean, I don't think it would be a grotesque encroachment on PayPal's freedom of association to say you're not allowed to discriminate against customers on the basis of their skin color. A few liberals, I think, would object to that infringement of PayPal's liberty. But by the same token, why should PayPal be free to discriminate against people on the basis of their political beliefs? If PayPal was a company based in the UK, it's actually headquartered in Luxembourg in Europe, PayPal Europe is, then we might have had a case against PayPal under the Equality Act 2010, which prohibits discrimination based on religion or philosophical belief. But because it's headquartered in Luxembourg, we didn't have that remedy at our disposal. But yeah, it was extraordinary to read that piece in the New Statesman. I think my theory about why the progressive left were such enthusiasts for lockdown, for the most part, is it's what a sociology student at Cambridge University, Rob Henderson, calls a luxury belief. So luxury beliefs are beliefs which virtue signal. So if you profess those beliefs, then you think you sound virtuous, you sound like one of the good guys, but they don't cost you anything to advocate them. And in the case of lockdown, I think it was very easy for people in the media, people in banking, people in the accountancy sector, politicians. It was very easy for people like that to advocate the lockdown policy because it costed them nothing. It was perfectly possible for them to work from home. They had great Wi-Fi, and if they had kids, they were probably at private schools, and the private schools were pretty good at providing remote learning for their pupils. So it cost them nothing. And what they got from advocating the policy was really a way of advertising that it cost them nothing because they were members of the elite. It was a kind of a way of advertising, signaling to people that you are a very privileged person and you can advocate this policy because your privileged lifestyle means it will cost you nothing. And that's, I think, what made it so attractive. It became a high status indicator amongst the kind of professional elite to advocate for this policy, which cost them nothing because they were members of the elite.
And in terms of Trudeau's, not just support for these kinds of lockdowns and mandates and so on and so forth, but really, he acted like a total bully. And he was trying to fine people and threatening to jail people. And then, as we mentioned earlier, doing things like freezing people's bank accounts. I mean, what's in it for him to support these lockdowns and these vaccine mandates and to vilify anybody who questions or opposes them as dangerous terrorists and, again, misogynist, racist, fascist, so on and so forth?
Well, my kind of overarching theory as to why so many politicians leapt on lockdowns as an attractive, effective response to the COVID pandemic, even though there was very little evidence before the policy was embraced that it would be effective. It had very rarely been tried before. It wasn't recommended by the WHO when it wrote its paper in 2019 about what to do if there's a viral outbreak. The UK's pandemic preparedness strategy recommended against quarantining the healthy as well as the sick. So it was a largely untried, untested, novel policy, which almost the entire political class across the world kind of embraced in lockstep. Why did they do that? I think they were terrified that if they weren't seen to be doing something, then unnecessary deaths might be hung around their necks at the next kind of electoral contest they were involved in. So they felt they had to be seen to be doing something without really caring whether it was effective or not. They didn't really, in Britain, there was no cost benefit analysis. There was no consideration of whether the cure might be worse than the disease. They just kind of leapt headlong into this policy because it was a way of seeming to do something. And the fact that everyone else was doing it as well gave them a kind of insurance. It was like, well, it might turn out to be wrong, but everyone else was doing it. So, who was I to challenge the overwhelming consensus of the kind of all my colleagues, all these other heads of state across the world? So I think that it's sort of political self-preservation, calculation. I think that's why people like Trudeau embraced the policy so enthusiastically. It was a kind of a form of insurance, protecting themselves against being accused of not doing enough, at the next election.
Right. I mean, ironically, it remains to be seen. We'll see what happens next time an election comes around. But I think that in the end, it did turn a lot of people against Trudeau, although he was reelected during the pandemic. So there you go. But it seems like
majority. But I do think he'll lose next time.
I think so too. I mean, I get the impression that people are going to vote conservative, especially now that Pierre, I'm going to say his last name wrong, but Pierre Poilievre, is now that he's the leader of the party, and he's been super outspoken and super critical of all this stuff and of Trudeau. And I think that's brought a lot of people over. I've never voted conservative in my life in Canada. In fact, I always voted NDP, which is our left Labour Party, which is just as bad as a Liberal Party, if not worse, but they, are never going to win a federal election. They've won provincial elections, and they do have some power. But, I'm going to vote conservative in the next election.
Glad to hear it.
And I don't think I'm alone in making that decision. But anyway, I want to get back to the PayPal thing. So, so we know the Free Speech Union is defending people against cancel culture, defending people's free speech rights. The Daily Skeptic is asking questions about, COVID mandates and government overreach and those kinds of things. Why were these accounts banned? Why were you targeted by PayPal?
Well, I still don't know, because PayPal has been completely unwilling, really, to engage in any kind of dialogue about it. When all three accounts were closed down, and they were closed down within minutes of each other, they were all told that they'd breached PayPal's acceptable use policy, without offering any more detail than that. And I appealed all three decisions. Those appeals were unsuccessful. I wrote to the CEO of PayPal UK. He didn't reply. I contacted the corporate affairs departments of PayPal UK and PayPal US. No response at all. I eventually got a response to an appeal on the Daily Skeptic account, which sort of obliquely, not explicitly, but the implication was that the Daily Skeptic had breached PayPal's policy on not promoting hate, violence, or racial intolerance. And I've no idea, what articles they imagined breached that policy on the Daily Skeptic. There was no detail offered, no articles singled out, nothing like that. And then when a Times of London journalist contacted someone in corporate affairs in the UK, they were told that the Daily Skeptic account had been closed because it spread COVID-19 misinformation.
Oh.
And I guess that may have been a reference to the fact that we have published a number of articles expressing reservations about the mRNA COVID vaccines. We don't have we are not an anti-vax publication. I've been vaccinated. My kids, I haven't taken the COVID vaccines, but I've been vaccinated against most things. My kids have too. But we've certainly expressed reservations. We've drawn attention to research published in scientific journals, which raises questions about the efficacy and safety of some of the COVID vaccines. And maybe that's what they mean by COVID vaccine misinformation. But in any event, they abandoned these two reasons when last Tuesday they restored all of my accounts. So I guess we weren't in the end guilty of breaching the acceptable use policy because they decided to restore all three accounts. But that was only after a tremendous backlash in the British press and in Parliament over here. An MP asked a question about it in Parliament. 42 parliamentarians signed a letter to the business secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, saying you've got to hold PayPal to account. And he then was quoted in a newspaper saying he thought that what PayPal had done was wrong. It was an example of cancel culture. So there was a head of steam, a political head of steam building up over here about what PayPal had done. And people were concerned about not just their shutting down of the Daily Skeptic and the Free Speech Union account, but there was an account belonging to a parent group called Us for Them, which lobbied against school closures during the lockdowns over here. And we now, I think more or less everyone now accepts that closing schools was certainly something that did more harm than good. And I don't think it would happen again, even if we went into another lockdown. But for some reason, Us for Them's account was shut down by PayPal at almost exactly the same time as my three accounts were shut down by PayPal. So there was a real backlash. And that's, I think, ultimately why PayPal did a reverse ferret and changed its mind. And of course, we won't now suddenly be using PayPal again as if, we can kiss and make up. I mean, I've said publicly that we won't be using PayPal again unless PayPal restore the accounts of all the individuals and organizations that they've shut for purely political reasons, and promise never to do it again. And I don't think they are going to promise not to do that. So what we're doing is, the Free Speech Union in particular is lobbying for a change in the law to make it impossible for financial services companies to withhold services from people whose political views, provided they're perfectly lawful, they disapprove of. And I hope that we will get a change to the law to that effect. I mean, we need to stop the emergence of a Chinese-style social credit system across the West, which is what we're beginning to see. That's how Trudeau crushed the Freedom Convoy. He persuaded Canadian banks to freeze the bank accounts of the protesters and their supporters. GoFundMe demonetized the supporters of the Freedom Convoy. We really have to stop financial services being weaponized in this way in order to enforce conformity with ideological dogma. That happens in China, and that's because China is not a free country. We don't want to see that kind of authoritarian system rolled out across the West. We need to nip it in the bud.
Right. Do you think that we're moving towards a cashless society and therefore, dependence on these kinds of digital platforms?
Yeah, no question about it. And that's what makes it so dangerous. This is, I think, the front line in the ongoing war against free speech. It's one thing to be kicked off Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, or to be shadow banned. That's bad enough just for having, the wrong opinions about an issue like whether trans women should be able to compete with women in women's sports, or access women's refuges, or enter women's changing rooms, and so forth. It's bad enough not being allowed to express a particular point of view on that issue across social media. But it's actually worse if you have banking facilities, payment processing facilities withheld from you, withdrawn from you, if you express those contentious opinions. That is a serious escalation in the war on free speech. And in our case, to demonetize the free speech union, we don't express, contentious views. We don't take a position on a whole range of issues. We just defend people's right to take positions, to set out their arguments in the public square, however contentious they might be. But if PayPal considers that unacceptable, and that's, I think, a new low.
Yeah, I got an email from PayPal a couple of days ago saying that they were updating their acceptable use policy, which, I get these emails fairly regularly, and I usually don't read all the way through, but I was curious to read all the way through this time in light of what had happened to you. And it said that, and this may not be new, but it does say in their acceptable use policy, which is going to be implemented in November, you may not use PayPal services for activities that, among other things, I'm not going to read this whole thing, involve the sending, posting, or publication of any messages, content, or materials that, in PayPal's sole discretion, are harmful, obscene, harassing, or objectionable, that depict, promote, or incite hatred or discrimination of protected groups or of individuals or groups based on protected characteristics, e.g. race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. Like they're not even that specific, and they didn't name sex. They just said gender identity. And then at the end it says are otherwise unfit for publication. So that could be anything at PayPal's sole discretion that are objectionable or unfit for publishing.
They need reining in. PayPal already have a track record of shutting down gender critical individuals and organizations. So Colin Wright, who has a PhD in evolutionary biology, and often expresses his gender critical positions, and he had his PayPal account shut down in June of this year. And when he asked them why, they said that he'd have to subpoena them if he wanted to find out why. But I think we know why. It's because gender critical views are considered to be hate speech by PayPal. That's why they shut down the account of Gays for Groomers a couple of weeks ago. Though curiously, there is a site called a group called Prostasia. I don't know if you've heard about them, Meghan, but they include within their organization a support group for minor attracted persons. So it's okay to fund an organization that has a support group within it for minor attracted persons, but if you're but Gays for Groomers, that's not acceptable. That's out of bounds as far as PayPal is concerned.
Or saying that there's a difference between males and females, that's unacceptable. But pedophiles, yeah. Okay.
I think when people appeal to that standard, when they say, yes, I believe in free speech, but I don't think that should be extended to hate speech, I don't think they realize, how nebulous the phrase hate speech is, and how subjective it is, and how it's weaponized frequently to shut down opinions of that people just happen to disagree with. A good example is the feminist campaigner Posey Parker. She tried to start a petition on a petition site called change.org. You're probably familiar with it. I think it's global. And in her petition, she asked the Oxford English Dictionary not to change its definition of woman to something other than adult human female. So her petition was urging the OED to keep the definition of woman as adult human female. And her petition was removed by change.org on the grounds that it was hate speech. So defining a woman as an adult human female is, in the eyes of this huge big tech social media platform, hate speech. So when people think that hate speech is just an unambiguous, clear, objective standard, they're mistaken. Saying a woman can't have a penis is hate speech.
Yeah. Who's behind this? Like, who owns PayPal? Who's making these decisions? Who decided that your free speech union and the Daily Skeptic and, you know, Colin Wright, Gays Against Groomers are so bad that they needed to have their accounts canceled?
Well, Dan Schulman, who is the CEO of PayPal globally, like the top guy, he gave a speech, I think, at Davos this year, in which he described himself as a thought leader in tackling the promotion of hate speech, hatred, and intolerance and misinformation across the internet. And he wants PayPal to be, you know, one of the global leaders in big tech to tackle this serious problem, which is undermining democracy. So I think it must come from the top. It must come from him. Anything which you know, in his view, isn't consistent with PayPal's values, by which it means the usual kind of woke litany of shibboleths, is, in his view, hate speech or misinformation, and he wants to lead the world in suppressing it.
Did they tell you why your accounts were reinstated?
Yeah, they said. Well, they said in the email that all three accounts got exactly the same email. They said that after a review, as though that's all it had been. You know, they initially said my accounts were permanently closed. They didn't say they were under review. But anyway, it said in the emails, after a review, we have decided to reinstate your account, and it also referred to input from its stakeholders and customers. And I think that might have been a reference to the fact that, you know, thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people, closed their PayPal accounts out of sympathy, solidarity with the Free Speech Union and the Daily Skeptic. I mean, I literally got thousands of messages via Facebook, Twitter, email, Instagram from people telling me that they had closed their PayPal accounts out of solidarity, and they'd let PayPal know why too. So it could be that they were actually beginning to lose business as a result of this overreach. And I thank all those people that did that. I mean, I do think it was very helpful. I also think questions being asked in Parliament, senior politicians condemning it, the possibility of a change in the law to make this kind of thing more difficult in future, all of that would have had quite a sobering effect, I think.
Yeah. I mean, like, I noticed it over the last couple of days. Like, we lost a whole bunch of people on PayPal, and I did see people in the comments telling me to cancel that as a donation system. And like I said, we're working on it today, actually, to get connected to Stripe instead. But I mean, I guess in terms of that argument that we heard in the New Statesman, but we've heard this all over the place in regard to big tech and, for example, Twitter bans or YouTube censorship. These are private companies. They can choose to deny service if they like. And, you know, in particular, that comparison to, you know, they can decide not to offer services to Toby if they don't like what he's doing, just like this baker has the right not to bake a cake for a gay marriage. I mean, how do you respond to that argument?
I think it's the Asher's case, which is that was the name of the bakery, which eventually won its case in the European Court of, no, I think it was in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and it won its case because it was an example of compelled speech, you know, forcing these Christian bakers to bake a cake for a gay wedding and to write a message on that cake, which effectively endorsed the institution of, a gay marriage. That was an example of compelled speech. They were being compelled to endorse a particular belief which they didn't hold. No one's asking PayPal to endorse any of my beliefs. They're just asking them to process the payments to people that want to join my organizations or donate to my organizations. So it's completely different. I mean, if I was saying to PayPal, you have to sign up to every aspect of my agenda, then I think PayPal could legitimately say, no, we're not going to do that. But it's a completely incomparable.
Right. And so in terms of, you said that you all are going to focus on changing the law so that companies like PayPal can't actually legally do this. What's the legal precedent there? I mean, what would we have to do in Canada, or what would we have to do in the US to stop companies like this? What are you working on doing in the UK?
Yeah, well, we've got a team of lawyers working on this. And I saw the first draft of the amendment that they've come up with tonight, and it looked quite promising to me. Essentially, it said if a financial services company withholds service from a particular customer, and the reason for doing that is because they disapprove of their perfectly lawful political beliefs, then the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, will tell them to restore the account. And if they don't, the customer would then have the right to sue the company for damages. And that's the gist of it. And I think that I think something along those lines is what we need and will be effective.
And do you think that those kinds of laws can be applied to companies like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook as well? I know that they've been fighting in some states, for example.
Yeah, in the state of Texas, they passed a law, I think, last year, making it illegal for big social media companies to kick people off their platforms because they dislike their political views, provided those views are perfectly lawful. And that was tested in a court in Texas last week and withstood the test. And it looks like it'll now go to the Supreme Court. But if the Supreme Court doesn't strike down that law, then that, I think, points the way forward. And I'd like to see other states pass similar laws. And I'd like to see the UK pass a similar law too. These people should be neutral referees. They are effectively the public square. And to have one side on a whole range of issues, making the rules to favor their side is just not on. And, I don't think it would be an encroachment, an unacceptable encroachment on their freedom of association to say you can't discriminate against your users in this way. It's unhealthy for democracy. We need free speech if we're going to elect the right leaders, make informed decisions, wrestle with issues like, where to draw the line between trans rights and women's rights when the two conflict. You can't just say it's our way or the highway. And if you disagree with us, we're going to kick you off the platforms. We're going to silence you. We're going to demonetize you. I mean, it's completely undemocratic. It's an affront to liberty. So I think laws along the lines that have been passed in Texas are completely acceptable. And I hope the Supreme Court agrees with me.
Mm-hmm. Why is big tech so woke? Like, why has big tech across the board decided to embrace these ideologies? Like, it's really weird.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's to do with a kind of a crisis within the sort of meritocratic cognitive elite. I think that they suffered a couple of really serious blows to their credibility, their authority. There was the global credit crunch, the war in Iraq, both seemed kind of disastrous, and then that led to a kind of major populist backlash with the election of Trump in 2016, the Brexit vote in the UK in 2016. I think they realized their authority was ebbing away. This sort of international, professional, cognitive elite that meet in Davos every year under the auspices of the World Economic Forum. And they realized they needed to somehow restore their authority, their legitimacy, and it used to be based on their expertise, the fact that they knew more than everyone else, and they could make better decisions. It was right that they were running things and had as much money and power as they did because they were experts. They knew what was best for us. It turned out their expertise, was pretty fragile, and they kept getting big things wrong. And I think they got the lockdown policy completely wrong too. But I think one way to try and restore their authority was to embrace this kind of new quasi-religious doctrine, whereby they become our kind of moral guides. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is their contribution to the world, a way of improving the world, of making it better, of making amends for the past sins of heteronormative white men. It kind of gave them a kind of a moral crusade, which kind of justified their enormous power and money. I think that had something to do with it. But it's also, it just seems to be the kind of, I think, the ebbing away of the Christian tide has obviously played a part too. People, they want a sense of meaning and purpose. They don't just want to think what they're doing is just about making money, maximizing value for their shareholders. They want to feel like they're doing some good in the world as well. And they no longer get that kind of sense of meaning and purpose, higher purpose from religion. That's kind of gone out of fashion. So this is an alternative. I think that's a part of it too. A couple of more cynical people than me have suggested that actually it's in the interests of these large capitalist corporations to embrace kind of wokery-pokery because they know it drives ordinary people completely crazy. So when Gillette kind of wages a campaign against toxic masculinity, ordinary people, when they see these ads, when they look at the kind of pride flags kind of flying above all the banks on the high street and so forth, it drives them nuts that all these people who are their kind of social and economic superiors are also claiming to be their moral superiors and wagging their fingers at them for being deplorable and bigoted and the rest of it. And that drives them nuts and into the arms of, right-wing demagogues like Donald Trump. And that makes regulation of these big corporations much less likely. So they're doing it for kind of cynical, self-interested, Machiavellian reasons. They're promoting an ideology and throwing it into the faces of ordinary people with a view to driving them completely nuts. So they'll run screaming into the arms of right-wing leaders who are then won't be as inclined as their left-wing counterparts to regulate these companies or tax them. So that's one theory.
Right. And I think that there's been a number of people who would be labeled conspiracy theorists who saw the COVID lockdowns, the COVID mandates, and all of that as connected to the move to a cashless society. And so further, state power in that regard, also potentially leading to and connected to a social credit system similar to China's. I mean, I'm not much of a conspiracy theory person, but I mean, it is a grasp at power. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of a cock-up than conspiracy person. I believe in, I think it's called Hanlon's law, whereby never attribute to Machiavellian diabolical conspiracy what can be explained by rank stupidity. And I think that law usually applies. But I do think that in the case of the lockdown policy, I don't think that, Klaus Schwab from his kind of eagle's nest in the Alps was kind of calling up people like Trudeau and urging them to impose a lockdown and threatening them with exposure of compromat if they refuse to do so. I don't think it happened like that, but I think that the international elite did quite quickly agree on a particular narrative frame. They agreed that the lockdown policy was the right way to mitigate the effects of this new virus, and that became very quickly the lens through which the pandemic was viewed. And I think I think that insofar as there is any conspiring, I think there may be a degree of collaboration and cooperation when it comes to deciding how to frame these issues, what the narrative should be. And that in turn becomes very powerful in driving behavior. But I don't think it goes beyond that. I don't think there's a degree of collaboration and conspiring beyond that.
So if people want to cancel their PayPal accounts, and for people who are wanting to support the Free Speech Union and the Daily Skeptic, what platforms can they use instead?
Well, I think Stripe seemed to be a pretty good bet. We've been using Stripe at the Daily Skeptic and the Free Speech Union since the beginning, and we've never had a problem with Stripe. And when PayPal closed our accounts, we wrote to all those people that are affected and urged them to switch to Stripe, and that hasn't created any problems so far. So I'm cautiously optimistic about Stripe as an alternative to PayPal, but there are plenty of other alternatives out there too.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, so far Stripe has seemed good on the free speech issue, and I know Stripe is what platforms, well, what Substack uses, and Substack is super committed to free speech, which is awesome. I'm really happy with them. Someone in the comments asks, well, I can answer this actually. Can people outside the UK join the FSU? And I'm a member, so I know that you can. But do you represent people outside of the UK?
Well, we can only do a limited amount. So they certainly get invited to our online events, and they have access to all our briefing materials, our frequently asked questions, and so forth. But we can't offer them legal help because it's a different legal. If they'll be in a different legal jurisdiction, and we can't claim to have any legal expertise about other jurisdictions. And we can offer them a minimal amount of PR help. And we can refer them to, our in-house counselor if they're finding, if they're going through mental anguish as a result of being targeted. So we can offer some services, but they're limited. We can't offer the kind of full insurance package that we effectively offer to our British members, which is a shame. But for that reason, the cost is much reduced. So it's only £2.49 a month for overseas members to join.
Okay. I have just one more question, and I'm just going to read this comment from the live chat that goes back to what we were talking about 10 minutes ago or something. I work in tech, and there's a lot of non-religious, well-intentioned, analytical people who think they possess Enlightenment era morality when it's often an inflated sense of superiority. Toby's not wrong. I mean, yeah, I think that I think that what's happened to progressives is that they've become the elite, they've gained a lot of power, and they do seem to have this idea that they're better and smarter than everyone else. And so they have to be authoritarian because these people are too stupid to make decisions for themselves or have their own politics.
Yeah, it's a very undemocratic philosophy, isn't it? It's sort of rooted in a kind of contempt for ordinary, less educated people than them, a kind of suspicion of ordinary people as being these kind of bigots and deplorables who can't be trusted. And, if you let them run riot on Twitter or Facebook, that'll just turn into a kind of toxic mess, which is why we need to exclude the more unruly elements. It's rooted in this kind of deep-seated, almost puritanical suspicion of kind of ordinary, unlettered people. At its heart seems to be a kind of loathing for democracy, which is, potentially very dangerous.
Yeah. How would one go about starting a free speech union in, say, Canada or the US?
Well, Jordan Peterson was in London a couple of weeks ago, and I went to a dinner that some people I know held for him. And we did have a little chat about the need for a free speech union in Canada. And we're hoping to follow up. I hope to have some news on that front in the not too distant future. There is a free speech union in New Zealand. There's also a free speech union in South Africa. And I'm talking to someone about setting one up in Australia. So I hope to set one up in Canada, or help some people set one up in Canada in the not too distant future, hopefully with Jordan Peterson's support.
That would be great. I mean, Canada really needs it. The situation with free speech in Canada is quite bad and potentially getting much worse.
It seems to be, yeah. People kind of argue about which is the worst place, across the Western world for free speech. It's definitely somewhere in the Anglosphere. The woke cult seems to have kind of taken root more in the Anglosphere than anywhere else. And we can discuss why that is. I think it's probably because, the high priests of the cult speak in English. It's their first language, and English is the language of social media. So it becomes much easier to disseminate this, to proselytize and spread this new religion in English-speaking countries. But amongst those English-speaking countries, I think Canada might well be, where the woke cult has found most fertile ground. The war on free speech in Canada seems to be more advanced than anywhere else in the world. So I think you desperately need a free speech union, and I hope to provide you with one in the not too distant future.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for joining the stream. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad that PayPal reinstated your accounts, but I mean, I think you're right. You've been like, I'm not gonna just kiss and make up with them. And I think the dependence on PayPal, which I think we've known for a little while now, but it's really, we can't avoid this truth now. Dependence on PayPal is really dangerous and a really bad idea. So I think we should get off of that if we're able to. But I also am glad that there was all this pressure and pushback, which forced them to recant.
Yeah. So. We have to now, they're on the back foot. So that's when we have to push harder. And it's not enough for them to restore my accounts. We really need them to restore the accounts of Colin Wright, Gays Against Groomers, all the people that have been cancelled by PayPal for wrong thinking.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your work. And we'll stay tuned to hear more about this free speech union in Canada that's desperately needed.
Thanks, Meghan.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Good night. Good night. Bye, Toby.
Bye.